Welcome to Thursday, the 14th day of November, 2024. This Day Weather Podcast brought to you by Converse County Tourism. Douglas and Glen Rock, Wyoming are bustling with action this holiday season. Plan your excursion, including fun activities, beautiful downtowns, and historic treasures. Learn more at conversecountytourism.com. As we roll through the end of this week, well, it's going to be fairly quiet today and tomorrow, so we may see more sunrises and sunsets like you're going to see in the photos coming on up. Just really spectacular last couple of days for those. But overall, we're not looking at much going on. Just kind of typical mid-November weather. Temperatures are going to be close to what we call the seasonal averages as we are under some high pressure. However, that stretched out storm system comes off the Pacific Northwest and splits. So we're pretty confident about what's going to happen between now and Sunday. The stretched out storm system is going to bring a little bit of snow into the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, and Montana, northwestern and far western Wyoming, and the counties bordering the Montana border. Not a lot, but a little bit of winter weather coming Friday night and Saturday in those areas. Then the southern piece goes all the way down into Arizona and New Mexico again. That is something we've seen this fall season, these splitting systems. That piece that goes to the south ends up bringing another period of wet weather for New Mexico, for parts of southern Colorado, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, then eventually Nebraska with kind of a pretty significant rain event with snow on the back side of it early next week. I think that scenario that we just unfolded between now and Monday we're pretty confident about that. It's what happens after that, because there's another system, a cold system, diving in behind that southern low. And then it's wanting to form that big low, wanting to sort of reorganize into a more cohesive, larger storm into the middle of the U.S. towards the middle of next week. And the potential is there for it to become a large storm, a significant storm. However, there's also the potential that it just won't come together. So we have a lot of questions and uncertainties, but I think that if it does come together, it will be impactful. So we're going to spend some time on it so you have a heads up on next week's weather, especially if you're a livestock interest or especially if you're going to be traveling in the region. Also, at the end of the podcast, I'm going to talk about this week, the European model has gone through an upgrade. They're doing this now rather frequently where they're tweaking it and making adjustments and trying to make the model better. And I want to show you some comparisons, and that might be interesting. Beautiful sunrises and sunsets, as I mentioned, all across the west as Pacific moisture comes in at the high levels this time of year. And we don't have any fire smoke anymore to deal with, so we just have these crystal clear skies and these beautiful vistas. As we take a look also into western Nebraska and southwest Nebraska, the recent moisture and the cold nights leading to a little bit of fog now as the water is warmer than the air above it. Satellite image this morning shows the area of high pressure overhead. We do have some winds aloft right here causing some high and mid-level clouds and some lenticular clouds east of the divide. But you can see up here, we've got nothing that looks really terribly organized, but cold, moist air is up here with that trough. That's what's going to come in this weekend. And there you can see the trough is analyzed right here. This broad area of high pressure across the nation's midsection. So a nice couple of days coming up. Here's the stretched out split system. This is by around the noon time on Saturday. That trough that's up there in the Pacific Northwest slides down, gets stretched out. We get two centers, one down here, the other one straddling the U.S.-Canadian border. This is going to bring in colder, moist Pacific air into the west, and this is what the precipitation forecast is looking like through about noon Sunday. So the trough is going to spread showers basically along and north and west of this line. Nothing terribly heavy except along the coast there where you're going to get a lot of rain. Inland, the system isn't as well organized, but there's going to be pockets of snow from the Dakotas and Montana, northwestern Wyoming, across Idaho, into the Sierras here, northern California. Then these showers here are developing ahead of the low that ends up this weekend down here in the desert southwest. This area of moisture right here grows and expands as that low kicks out ahead of the next low, as you'll see here in a minute. This is what the snowfall forecast looks like through Sunday as well. So western Wyoming and into the interior here, if you're going to be traveling along Interstate 90 in Montana, you're going to encounter a little bit of winter weather. That takes us through Sunday. By Monday, that low that on Sundays down here gets kicked out by this guy. We call this a kicker. This comes in and kicks out this low and kicks it up to the north. And this is part of the problem with trying to find the solution, because the models are having a real difficult time on what to do with this guy and how these two should interact. Initially, it wants to kick it out, but this storm is strong and cold enough that it could draw this back in, or it may go out like this. So we'll show you here in a minute on kind of what the scenario is and where the difficulties lie in next week's weather forecast. But as this low kicks out, it's got moisture available. So again, it's going to get wet. Look at this. This is going to be another widespread area of rain, snow on the back side. So this area continues the very wet streak that has started about 3 or 4 weeks ago and continues for New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, far eastern Colorado, and areas of Nebraska here are going to get wet. The system comes on in, and as the low comes out, it's going to produce this area of moisture right here. Here's the moisture coming in from the next system diving in behind it. And on the back side, now this isn't going to be as big as last week's storm, but there will be on the colder back edge of the system more snow for northern New Mexico and possibly southeast Colorado, believe it or not. So that gets us through Monday. Pretty sure of this scenario right here. After that, this is where we're going to give you different scenarios on the models. And remember, we're talking about something that's not quite a week away, but several days out. So there's going to be some differences and some changes along the way. But this is by noon Tuesday. The European model takes that next low and takes it all the way into Arizona and has a pretty strong system coming together. This is what's left of the low that gets kicked out. Notice it's all the way up here into Minnesota on the European model. Now what we'll do is we'll step through the differences. The European model is more consolidated, more to the south, much more than it was showing a day or two ago. This is the Canadian model, wanting to do the same thing, but you see this guy up here? That's the low that gets kicked out, and it wants to bring it back in, so it has a stretched out north-south axis of the low pressure system here, while the European is much more consolidated, and this low weakens as it gets ejected to the north. Both solutions are plausible, although this one is probably keeping too much energy right here. Nonetheless, that's what the Canadian model looks like. This is the GFS model. Big differences between the Canadian, the European, and the American model. Keep in mind, this is the model right here that almost all of your phone apps use. And you have to be careful when doing that when you look at your long-range forecast, because this scenario is completely different than these two. It's much weaker, it's much more to the north, it's much warmer than these two solutions here. So, could this solution happen? Probably not. I think this is an error. So what I want to show you is another way to look at the 500 millibar pattern, but using sort of a different way of displaying it in colors, because it makes it a little bit easier to see the highlights here. What I'm showing you is the 500 millibar, 18,000 foot level that I show you all the time, but I'm showing you what the anomaly is. What this means is where you see blue, think low pressure. Where you see the pink, brighter colors, think high pressure. And the black lines are lines of equal pressure. So it's kind of a better way to see how this all comes together. So the European model, this is by 5 p.m. on Wednesday. So what I just showed you was through noon Tuesday. By late Wednesday, notice that the European model here is consolidating the low pressure system over the southern plains, while we have this big area of high pressure over Canada. Notice the spacing. I mentioned this before. When you see even spacing like this is where you get organized storms, because you have the right configuration of highs and lows going around like this. You see all this pink up here? This high pressure up here means there's a lot of cold air in Canada able now to get drawn in by this storm in the counterclockwise spin. This is why we're concerned about next week a major winter storm coming together, because historically this configuration tends to lead to that. But the models are having somewhat of a difficult time, as you know. So the European looks like that. The Canadian is more east and more north, but both are quite strong. Then, when we take a look at the GFS model for later on, notice the GFS model pulls the low that was up here, tries to bring it back south. What it's trying to do is self-correct. But it's an elongated north-south system, and it's a lot more to the east. So there's a lot of forecasts right now that are talking about this part of the country seeing a major winter storm next week, when in reality, it's probably going to be more like the European or the Canadian, just because that's how they end up usually happening. But we can still see that configuration of the three troughs, the pink up over Canada, and we really see that on the European, to a lesser extent, a little bit less organized on the GFS. If we take a look at the ICON model, which also comes out of Europe, it comes out of Germany, it is the most scary looking model because it has a deep, intense storm over western Kansas. It's got the cold air available in Canada. It's got the Gulf of Mexico wide open. And look at the scale. Look how large this storm is in terms of real estate. So it could end up being centered here. It could end up being centered here. But the trend in the models right now is for this to set up more in the nation's midsection. So what does this mean for where you live? And are you going to get a ton of snow? Are you just going to get colder, get windy? I don't know yet. But I know that this configuration tends to lead to strong central U.S. We'd call it a mid-latitude cyclone or a strong winter storm. And I say winter because it's got cold air to tap into, unlike the last couple of storms. So I'm putting this area on notice. What I'm doing here with that yellow oval is saying within that oval, there is a likelihood of a high-impact winter storm coming towards the middle of next week. We'll see what tomorrow brings. This could all fall apart. I might be making a bigger deal out of this than it should be, but I want to give you a heads up, especially livestock interests and travelers, because if this does come together, this will be impactful. But that area is where I think the bigger impacts are going to be initially. Now, it will then move off to the east slowly, probably head up to the Great Lakes in the upper Midwest after that. But this could be something across a large part of the U.S. where it really has a big impact on the weather. As we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, we had an update that happened early this week where the European model got an upgrade. Basically, they're trying to upgrade the European model once a year. I'd like to tell you that the GFS or the American model gets through the same upgrade. It has gone through some upgrades and it will, but not as regularly as the European does. And I want to thank Ryan Maui, who put this graph together. Follow him on Twitter. He's a great Twitter follower, or X that you call it now. This is basically a way to score model how well the models are doing. You take the 500 millibar level at these degrees of latitude north, and if we were just to compare the model going back to 2008 to present and score them, how well they're doing in terms of forecast verification on a 5-day forecast. The blue line represents the European model, the red line represents the GFS model, and how well they score. Now, you could use a lot of other things, but using the 500 millibar pressure level is a good way to do it. And you can see, a lot of people ask me, is the European better than the GFS? Yes, most of the times it is. Not always. Not always. There are some times the GFS model ends up being right and the European is wrong. But over time, if you were to score them, you can see it's consistently better and by about the same margin throughout the course of really the last couple of decades. You know, one thing that's really interesting about this, notice that when one model does poorly, so does the other one. They kind of show the same trend line on different times of the year and different years where they do better than others. But with the upgrade in the European model, it constantly trying to tweak things and make things better more frequently in the GFS model. That's why I tend to show you the European model a lot more. But it's like anything. It's not 100% of the time more accurate. It has better days than the GFS though. And I think the storm next week is going to highlight that. Have yourself a good Thursday. We'll see you tomorrow.